Welcome to week 2 of this weekly lecture series on UI and UX design. Last week we talked about some interface do's and don'ts, and we talked about analyzing the various elements that go into a user interface. This week we are going to talk about flow diagrams, and I will show you how to create a flow diagram, and we will also talk about use cases. This is an example of a flow diagram. Basically, a flow diagram shows you how you can move from one screen to the next with various buttons on the screen. A good flow diagram should show what each button in an interface does, linking it to the next screen that button takes you to. When you're making a flow diagram, you want to start with the first screen, or an important central screen that the player spends a lot of time on. Generally, we want to start with the start screen when you launch the game. Then you want to look at each of the buttons that you're going to have on that screen and think about what they do. For each significant button, create a new screen that button takes you to, and draw an arrow connecting them. There are a lot of tools you can use for creating a flow diagram. You can use Photoshop or Illustrator, which are just general art programs, or you can use something that is made specifically for flow diagrams, like Glyphy or Draw.io. For this example, I'm going to show you how to use Draw.io, which is integrated into Google Docs. So if you are on your Google Drive account, you can create a Draw.io diagram by pressing the blue New button and then going to More. And you may already see Draw.io diagrams listed here. If you do not see it listed here, you can hit this plus to connect more apps. Then search for Draw.io and add it from this list so that it is connected to your Drive folder. Once you've added it, you should see it in this list under More. So let's select Draw.io diagrams now to create a new one. We'll start with a blank diagram. There are a lot of different tools you can use inside of Draw.io to really customize the visuals of your flow diagram, but the simplest way to do it is to just start with the basic rectangles. You can have a rectangle for each of your screens, and you can decide what color you want the rectangle lines to be and how thick you want the borders to be. And you can also decide if you want it to be filled in or not. For each of my screens, I'm just going to leave them filled in with white. And so this will represent my start screen. Then inside of my start screen, I want to think about what buttons I will have. Generally, a start screen has, at the very least, a start button and an exit button. And to type into these, I'm just dragging the rectangle in and then double-clicking on it so I can type. And I'm labeling these as what those buttons are. And you can adjust the size and shape and visuals of these buttons however you like, but the visuals aren't really important at this point. It's helpful to keep everything kind of neutral in terms of visuals at this stage because you're not thinking about how it looks artistically. We're just designing how does the user move through the different screens. For buttons, sometimes it can be helpful to have a gradient because that gives a better indication that that thing is actually a button. This is not necessary, but it can help if you want to use it. And you can also change things like the text. So here I can change my text color to black, and you can change the, whether it's italicized or bold. You can also change the font size. Let's make this 20. And I want to make both my start button and my exit button matching. You can also copy and paste things very easily by Control C and Control V. And this is helpful if you decide you want to add another button. So another button that's common to have on start screens is an options button, which would take you to an options menu. When you're dragging the items in your screen, you'll notice that it snaps to the grid. And if you want to just move it by pixels, you can use the up and down or left and right arrow keys to make fine adjustments. So now I have these three buttons on my start screen, and I need to decide where they go. The Start button will take me into the game, and depending on the type of game, there are a variety of screens that may pop up before the game actually launches. One thing that is common is to have the ability to load from previous saves. And you might notice when I dragged in this rectangle, it automatically filled it in with my gradient from before. So I'm going to uncheck gradient to bring this back to white. And so let's say my game has the ability to load from a previous save or to start a new game. So I'm going to copy and paste my start button and bring that over here. And so this will be new. And then I will have a load button. Now, it's important to think about if the user ends up on this screen, what if they change their mind? Right now, I don't have any way for them to go back to the start screen. It's really important to make sure that anytime the user needs to get back from the screen that they've started, that you include a back button. So this is the screen that will pop up from the start button. So I need to connect these with an arrow. If you hover over these little blue X's, you can see I get this green circle around it that tells me that I can connect something. And if I hover over the box that I'm currently in, you can see it attempts to draw an arrow to that box. And if I drag it over here to the second box, I can see it gives me an arrow to that box. Then I also want to be able to go from the back screen back to this previous page. It's really important here to make sure that your arrows start from a button and end at the edge of a screen. It's very easy to get confused about your layout if you accidentally connect a screen to a screen or a button to a button. For example, here I have a screen going to a screen, but you don't know which button is actually causing this to happen. You can delete unneeded arrows by just selecting it and pressing the delete key. It is also very confusing if you have a button going to another button. So the next thing I want to do is look at the next button down, which is my options button. I'm going to make another screen, which will be my options menu. And I'm going to take an arrow from my options button and bring it down to the options menu. By the way, if you don't like the sort of curvy, squiggly lines, this actually I don't think is the default. This is the default that I set up. Yours probably looks more like, let's see, probably not a straight line. Yours might look like this, or it might look like, whoa, that's not what we want. There are a lot of different options that you can use for this from this drop down here. This is on the style page for the arrow. And you can also change the thickness of the arrow. So I might want these to be sort of thin. One thing to note though is you want the arrow lines to be different from the lines of your windows, because otherwise it gets confusing when those lines cross over. So you could either make it thicker than the window, or you could make it a different color. Sometimes I like to use blue or purple for my arrows because it just makes them really pop out from the background. But you do want to make sure that all of your arrows are the same style. That way it's not confusing what they're doing. Oh, here's so you can change from curved, you could change it to sharp, which makes it have those sort of corner edges. So if you don't like the curviness, you can select sharp. You can also select rounded, which just sort of rounds off those curves. I actually like the rounded one, so I think I'm going to use that. Here you can see kind of a common mistake that happens is when you're just clicking around, here I've accidentally created an extra line here that I don't want. So make sure that you are always checking for those. And you can always undo if you realize you've made something and it's hard to click on it to get rid of it. So just Control Z to undo those. So I'm going to go ahead and make all of my arrows be rounded. You can also change what the end of the arrow looks like if you wanted to, say, have a diamond or an open arrowhead. That's totally up to you for how you want it to appear visually. Alright, so I have my options menu going down here to this screen. So now I need to fill in what goes on my options screen. First thing is I want to make sure that I have a back button. It's very important to always remember. So I'm going to start with that one. That takes me back to my main menu. We also will probably have some other buttons, like a very common way to do options in video games is to have a second option screen that you get to for video, and then, or graphics, sometimes it's called graphics, and then one for audio, and then one for controls. Here I'm just stacking all of them until I have them typed in, and now I'm going to make my window big enough for all of these. Back button is generally always at the bottom, so I'm going to keep that consistent. And now I will stagger out the rest of these. So now each of these are actually going to take me to another window, and I'm just going to show one as an example, but if you're doing this for your game, you definitely want to fill out all three of these buttons. So just as an example, I'll go ahead and do the controls. Actually, you know what? No, I will do video. So I will have the video going to this screen here. And so here's where I probably am not going to have more buttons. What I'm going to have here is very likely I'll have a drop-down menu for my resolution. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add some text items. So I will have a text for resolution. And you can adjust the width of a text box so it goes all the way around the word. That helps a little bit. And I'm going to need this box to be a little wider. So I'll have a text item. By the way, text is right here in the general section. And then I will have another one for graphics quality. And I will have one for shadows. A lot of games have the ability to turn off the shadows because shadows can cause a lot of performance issues on some computers. So it's helpful to give the user the option to turn off the shadows. And if you want your text to line up, right now all of the text is centered within their box. On the text page, you can select left justify so that they all line up with each other. And we want to space these kind of evenly apart. Now, not all games do this, but since we're doing this for just mocking up the layout, I'm going to include a colorblind mode because I think it's really important to include colorblind mode as an option because there are a lot of players who end up playing your game who might have some form of colorblindness. And this offers the option to have a more high contrast and have a different colored version of the game, so it's easier to see for anyone with vision impairments. So now I have these 4 different text sections, and I need to put something next to it for what the user is actually going to interact with. So for resolution, I'm going to add, this is going to represent a drop down, and I'm going to put 1920 by 1080 as the default. And I'm going to make my text size smaller for this so that I have space. I'm going to go ahead and put a triangle. This is again from the general section. And you can scale this down with these blue dots. And you can also use, you see here where it has this little rounded arrow, I can use this to rotate around so that it is now pointing downward. And this is going to show that this is a drop-down field. And back on the style page, you can change this fill color so that it makes more sense. And once again, we're not doing anything visual right now. This is just to show what things the user can interact with and what screens they can get to and what they'll be doing on those screens. So this is really not important what this looks like. This is just giving us an idea to get started. So next I would have graphics quality. And for that, I'd probably have another drop down. I'm going to select both of these and Control C and Control V. And oops, undo that. And so I'm going to go ahead and drag these down. And I'm going to change this to say, I'll do the default as high graphics quality. So these choices then would be high, medium, and low. And so for shadows, I might have a checkbox. Let's see if we have checkbox as one of our options. Here we have a check mark. So I'm going to bring that in, and I'll just bring in a regular box and set the fill color for that back to white. And then I'll scale these down. Oops. And then I will take my arrow and put it inside of the box. Now you might notice that it has gone behind the box. You can arrange the order by right-clicking on an element, and you can tell it if you want to move it to the front or to the back. So I'm going to bring this to the front. Scale that down, and I'm going to copy this box that I'm using so I get one of the same size. Bring that down for colorblind mode. Once again, this will be a checkbox. And I'm going to leave one of these not filled in. So it shows this is what it looks like when it's selected, and this is what it looks like when it's not selected. So once again, if you're doing this for your own game, you'll want to do this for all 3 of these. But this is just an example. So this is what I'm going to do for the video options. So now back up to our other screen where we have new and load. We definitely want to show where these screens are going to. Now you might notice that I'm starting to run a little bit out of space, but the nice thing about draw.io is when you hit the edge, it automatically adds more space for you. Same with when you hit the top. So I'm going to have this window here for when I load a game. And then I'm going to have one up here for when I start a new game. Now for my new game, I'm going to go ahead and say for the purposes of this layout that selecting the new game button just drops me straight into the game view. So I don't need any buttons here unless there's going to be buttons actually inside of the game view, which a lot of games do not have buttons that you need to click on, or buttons that they have in the game are actually just actions that you take in the game. For games where you have a pop-up options menu, a lot of times those you just press a key on the keyboard. So I'm just going to type game view in here, And I'm going to go ahead and center the text for this one. Now, it is helpful if you're going to have some kind of options menu that can pop up in the game to show how you would get to that. And it might be this same options menu here. The one difference is that the back button would go to a different place. So I'm going to go ahead and select everything on this screen and copy it. And then I'll come up here and paste it. Oops. And so I'll just drag this up here. And I know I said previously not to connect one screen to another screen, but in this case, we don't have a button on the screen that's taking you to the options menu. So it is just a keyboard press. And so I will take an arrow here from the game view to the options menu, but I'm going to add a text label here. And if you double click on your arrow, it'll actually add text onto the arrow. I'm going to type escape here. So this is if the user presses escape, it takes them to this options menu. Then in this case, the back button will take you back to the game view rather than taking you back to the start menu like this back button does. So from our load screen, we might have some options here of different saves that they can use. And we'll also have a back button at the bottom. So here's my back button. And I will put a couple of options here for, let's do save 1 and save 2. You might have a longer list than this depending on the type of game you have, but I'm going to say for the purpose of my game that these are, this is a game where you probably are only keeping 1 or 2 active saves at a time. So here my back button will go back to this previous screen, and save 1 and save 2 will both launch into the main game view. So there you have it. This is a basic idea of a flow diagram, and this is not necessarily the kind of exact flow diagram that you would have for your game. A lot of this stuff depends on how your game actually works, so it's important to consider your game design when you're thinking about creating your flow diagram. When you're done creating your flow diagram and you want to save it, you can go to File and then Export As. And you can export it as an image, a PNG, or a JPEG. And one thing that's really helpful in here is to add a border, because what it tries to do is it actually crops it perfectly around your elements, which means things that are at the edge, it will get cropped right to the edge of it. So I like to add a little bit of border space, and when I export mine, I usually add 10. Then when you hit export, it will ask where you would like to save it. And these are some options you have if you want to save it online. If you're working with a team, you can save directly to a Trello board. But if you just want the image, you can download it. It automatically takes the name of the file that you're working in. So it's helpful to name your diagram. And you can name it from your file menu, right here, rename. So you can name your document. I'll call mine flow diagram 1. And now when I export it, it will automatically name it as flow diagram 1. And then you just hit download to save your image. So that's how you create a flow diagram. Now, if you are making a flow diagram for an existing game, rather than creating everything from scratch, you can actually start with screenshots of the actual images of the game, like you would have here. So you can see this is a screenshot of an actual game menu, and then it shows a line connecting one of the buttons on the screen to the page that that button goes to. So you can see that each of the buttons they haven't done it for every single button, but each of the major buttons, they have a line showing how to go from one button to another screen. So you can see these buttons up here take you to this screen. This button here takes you to this screen. It can be really helpful for practice to do a version of a flow diagram for a game that you really like. And make sure that you include all of the screens and don't skip over one, otherwise it gets confusing very quickly. So now I want to talk a little bit about use case. A use case is a progression of a single case of a user's experience with a product or service, including all interactions. An example of a use case is, here's an example that uses a restaurant, and it shows what each of the different people who interact with the restaurant are doing. For example, at the top you have a waiter who receives an order for food and then serves the food and then facilitates the payment at the end of that transaction. Below that you have the client, which is the person eating at the restaurant, and the client first orders the food, then eats the food, and then pays for the food. This is an abstract example of a use case where it shows very broadly how all different users, all of the most common users at least, would interact with the service. A use case can either be abstracted to just show those interactions of each of the particular users, or it can be built as an instance of your flow diagram with one specific user in mind. So you might highlight the arrows in your flow diagram for what a specific user would do when they're interacting with your game. A good example of that is a new user. They would probably start by pressing the start button and then selecting new game. So you can show an example of what one type of user is going to do when they interact with your interface. When you're making a use case, you want to start by thinking about a particular user. Who is that user and what is their primary goal? And then think about what steps that user will take to reach their goal when they're interacting with your interface. Then you draw out the user's steps, either in an abstracted view or overlaid on the flow diagram by highlighting which arrows they'll be following. And then it's a good idea to test on an actual user to see if your use case holds up. You can do this by printing out your flow diagram and showing it to someone without the arrows, and then asking them to select which button they would want to use on each screen and telling them which screen that takes them to. That way you can map out a path for that user to take and see if your flow for the user is intuitive. It's always really important to stay focused on the user when you're doing this process. It can be easy to begin thinking about the elegance of your design and how interesting the thing is that you're creating, and to forget that someone is actually going to be using it and that you need to have them in mind when you're creating it, otherwise they will end up having a bad experience. Like the person who might try to use this escalator and has to duck down below the ceiling. That's it for this week. Next week we are going to cover wireframes.